on the mobile app. Haven't used this before, thought I'd try it. But I've just come out of the gym, and when you're in the gym you get ideas, and I've been going through my head trying to build a keynote that I'm doing in a couple of weeks. And I've rewritten it a couple of times because the focus is on agility, but what I keep talking about is Agile. And agility is not necessarily related to Agile. You can have agility in your testing without being on an Agile project. And I know that because that is how I learned to work on an Agile project. Because on various waterfall projects, we had to adapt what we were doing based on changing timescales, based on requirements. When you're actually doing your testing, you discover the things you've been told are wrong, so you have to adapt and change them. The templates weren't working, so we threw them out and worked differently. And a lot of my test approach was about removing waste, about responding to the stakeholders in a way that added value as quickly as possible. And a lot of these are traits that you have to do in Agile. Because what Agile does is it forces you to work with agility in theory. Because you're working in smaller iterations, you don't spend as much time working out what you're going to do in advance, so you have to kind of make it up on the fly. And that leads on to trust, because you have to trust your ability and your team's ability to make decisions based on their experience, based on what they're told, based on what they can learn. So they have to be able to learn, so they have to ask questions, and it has to be allowed to ask questions. Now, very often on waterfall type projects, we were allowed to ask questions, but only at the start, not as you went through, because that would delay things. On Agile, you have to ask questions all the way through. And agility is incrementally building a model that we use when we are testing. So if we're doing exploratory testing, we may know nothing about the application. So we start to use the application and test the application. As we do that, we build up a model. We may be writing down the flows, the screens, what the screens do, the functionality, what the technology is. We may be making ideas on what limits we have in terms of how we're observing things, whether we're seeing the traffic, whether we know what we're doing. Building up a lot of questions. We're building up a model on the fly, an incremental model that we have to explore. That is working with agility, because we are incrementally changing and adapting. And we learn to work that way, so we learn to trust ourselves as we do it. And I think that's one of the key things with agility, because very often if I start then talking about Agile, we then start talking about the rituals in Agile. And the rituals very often are an excuse not to use agility. So you've got Three Amigos, you've got stand-ups. There may be no agility in there. We may just be doing them because that's what we do in Agile. Moshe Feldenkrais, I can't remember his exact quote, so I'll paraphrase it. It's, if you are learning, then you know multiple ways to do something. I'll paraphrase it like that. And to me, that's basically, we have multiple ways to do something because we know what we're trying to achieve. The focus is not on how you do something. The focus is on what you are trying to achieve having done something. So you will have learned ultimately what that is because you have multiple ways of exploring it. As an example, if you were going mountaineering and you've got a route mapped all the way to the top and there's an avalanche and it blocks your route, you have to find a different way. You're going up, you've got some tools, the tools break, you have to reuse other tools in different ways. You know multiple ways of getting there. If you are standing up, because Moshe Feldenkrais was doing physiotherapy type stuff, if you have to stand up and you only know one way to stand up, then that's not really flexible. If your way to stand up is to say what you did yesterday, what you're going to do today, and any impediments, that might not be the most effective way to get what you want out of the stand-up, unless what you want out of the stand-up is just to fulfill the ritual. So agility is more than that. Agility is about responding to the actual needs in the context. And that's why context-driven testing as a term is quite useful, because it forces you to think, what is my context? What are my constraints? What am I trying to achieve? Who am I working with? How am I trying to do this? And the last thing I just wanted to cover, because essentially I could have just made notes, but I thought I'll go live. I'll do this live and try and talk these notes out. Do you trust yourself? Do you take your own advice? Like when you're talking to people, I'm talking essentially to me at this point. so that I can take my own advice, so that I remember this later on. I was talking to someone this morning, I gave them advice about their Twitter feed and their blog, and then I'm thinking, do I actually take my own advice? Do I apply that to my advice? That is a key thing in terms of learning. And if you're in management, this is even more important, because very often you're in a position where you're telling people, but you're not doing. And if you can't take your own advice that you're giving people in management, or if you haven't done those things before, you should be cautious about doing it. That's why in Agile, we attempt to trust the teams, because they're on the ground, they're doing it. If we tell them what to do, we take responsibility away from them, we disempower them, and we then become responsible for the advice we've given, and we may not have taken it, and it may not be appropriate in this context because we may not know everything. So I encourage you, when you're giving advice to people, or you're chatting to them, or you're saying, well, why don't you try this, why don't you try that? Make sure you're taking your own advice. And the easiest way to do that is, when you tell people things, write it down and review it later on to see if it applies to what you're doing. So I am going to review this later on in the hope that it helps me with my keynote and my blog posts, and hopefully there's enough value in here for you. And now I have to figure out how on earth I end this live stream. And that bit's not going well. Cross. Are you sure you want to stop streaming? Yes, we do. See you later. Bye bye, YouTube.